Greetings and welcome to the Sar off the Mage experiment. Tonight I've got a guest, a friend of mine, Derek Hunter, an author from Los Angeles. He's written this amazing book, Anonymous Agnostic Antichrists. It's all about the Shakespeare authorship question, really, although it's deeper than that. It's a novel, and it's very interesting. But to people who don't know much about even Shakespeare, because this is generally a kind of magic channel, we'll touch on it. But it's, literature is magic anyway, isn't it, Derek?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So, what drew you to, as an American, I guess, because in Britain they're still obsessed with Shakespeare, but are they still in America? And if so, how did you get into Shakespeare? And then how did that lead? So it's a three-pronged question. How did that lead to you being interested, if not obsessed, as you must be with the authorship question?
Yeah. Well, thank you for reading the book, because I know we it's not an easy one to get through.
It's very enjoyable, but there's a lot of stuff in here, complex poems, stream of consciousness, could be code, craziness, and about 15 or 16 separate male characters that all start with Tom something. Kinda. Few, most.
You got Thomas North, Thomas Sackville, Thomas Middleton, Thomas Kidd. You got just one Thomas after another. Yeah.
And we're all Shakespeare is your contention.
Yes. Well, so how did I get into this? Well, so this is a book that is 30 years in the making. So what happened was I grew up in around different cities in the country, but mostly in Los Angeles and then in Seattle. And my stepfather, who I grew up with, who I had kind of a rocky relationship with, was an ex-Shakespearean actor. So my first kind of introduction to Shakespeare was through him. He would recite Shakespeare at home, but I wasn't really that into it then, because for me, like any kid, I think you don't necessarily like what your parents do, right?
Yeah, so absolutely. It's not cool.
Yeah, it's not cool, So I didn't really get into it then. And he would sing musical tunes, which I still don't like. And then he would do astrological charts, which I now am into. I know a lot less about astrology than other things in the occult. But my first real kind of like love of Shakespeare happened when I was in high school, and I had an absolutely fantastic English teacher who was just very dramatic and just engaging and exciting in terms of what Shakespeare was all about. And I really got into all the stories. That's when I got really hooked. And I got hooked into the language, the characters, the themes, just all of the different the things that are involved in the plays and poetry. Just so rich, just infinitely rich, layer upon layer upon layer. And I just was fascinated. Neat. And so I always had this habit of whether it became with music or bands or artists of any kind, painters. I always wanted to know who was the person who was behind it. Who was this individual that was like created these works? So, and then I actually had to write like an essay about the life story, the biography of William Shakespeare. So I did that. I had to research. So I researched and read some books, and I'm like enormously disappointed. I was just enormously just like, who the hell was this? There's no connection between
I'm not an entity, really.
Well, what's interesting is that people say there's not a lot known about him, but that's not true. There's a lot known about him, but everything that we do know are just business transactions. And he was definitely not a humane businessman whatsoever. You'd be much more. You basically kind of like a Donald Trump without the charm or humor. And I don't like Donald Trump at all, but basically just someone who was didn't pay his taxes, went after other people, and sued people right and left for small amounts of money. And there was
that's crazy.
Mm-hmm. So I
The,
think
the,
what
sorry.
you brought up an interesting thing was that in this country there's actually quite a love for Shakespeare too. There's definitely a love and
Excuse me.
probably also a bit more open-mindedness to the Shakespeare authorship question because it's we don't Shakespeare belongs to the English, right? It's the English
Yeah.
national hero. So there's more
Yes.
open-mindedness, I think, here being someone else.
Absolutely. Now, can I just say, as a Scot, we had Burns night the other night. He's our national poet, not that fella, but of course Shakespeare. The works of Shakespeare are, a few times they're listed in your book. We've got that one from there. We've got that one from there. So basically, your main contention is that it was or is there some fantasy involved, or is this your absolutely academic opinion on the?
So
Oh,
what happened was in the last 30 years I've been researching in terms of well I really don't think it was Shakespeare because the key thing with this is that there in those times there was evidence of what's called a literary paper trail, right? And so there's definitely a presence in terms of uh, where a person is involved in their life with being a writer, right? And so when it comes to Shakespeare, so the only thing that we have is his name or on the plays and poetry. But when you look into those times, there's misattributions right and left. People are given credit for things that are not theirs all the time, and so and including Shakespeare, this is very much the case. So basically, what I did was just looked really these last 3 decades. Just looked into well, if it wasn't Shakespeare, and I did change my mind. There were many. I changed my mind like thousands of times, thousands and thousands of times, because I've just never been able to really truly find um, something 100% foolproof, like in terms of theories. There's been many alternative candidates. If you go on Wikipedia, there's 80 alternative authorship candidates.
wow,
From
80. That's crazy.
yeah, there's
Yeah.
80. In my process of writing this story, I created my own too, which were not even considered by anyone. Um, so it's something that I just became obsessed with this. So I in terms of do I feel that it's been solved? I would say that no, I don't think so. I don't think it's been solved, and I don't know if it ever will be. But in terms of Thomas North, definitely the work of Dennis McCarthy, and then also Michael Blanding and June Schluter, done enormous work to show that at least he was involved. And so Dennis went in the last 15 years has been just dedicated to showing the connection to Thomas North's writing, which is translations basically, and the plays themselves. And so my problem was just in terms of the timeline, and then also too in terms of the quality of the writing. And so that's why for me in this novel I introduced these other authors who to me were were amazing authors in their own, from Thomas Middleton to John Webster to even Edmund Spencer as well was involved,
Yeah.
and many others, Marlowe, Kidd, Johnson, Barnfield. So it was I really felt I wanted to explore this book as the Shakespeare canon was a creation, almost like an egregore, that
Yeah.
it was a group of people.
Absolutely. It seems, when you think about it, how likely is it that one guy sort of, would have access? It does. Your conclusion is natural to me, even if not all of them necessarily, because there's just no paper trail for some of it, like you say. But it's a fascinating time, and the birth of really English literature in the British part of the Renaissance, because it had been Italian really until then.
Well, that was the other element too, is that I didn't want the book to just be about like proving this is how the Shakespeare plays and poetry were written. I felt very strongly for a long time that in many ways our modern sense of ourselves started at this period.
Yeah.
In terms of definitely for sure, like modern English language was created by these people during this time, during the English Renaissance, and
Yeah.
it was just an amazing explosion, like a nuclear bomb of creativity. But in terms of the philosophical aspect of the book, right? It was really the first time in history where people really truly devoted their artistic creations to putting human beings center stage over the divine, over the states, over all of these different things. It's really quite the Shakespeare canon is actually quite radical when you look at it and you look at it in the context of history. And I was definitely very inspired by Harold Bloom in his book, The Invention of the Human. So he wrote a book called The Invention of the Human, which he argued that the Shakespeare work, the Shakespeare canon, it wasn't as if humans didn't exist before then, but it was the
Yeah.
first
It
time
was.
where someone devoted so much time and
He
energy.
invented psychology, or they invented psychology in a way, because they were
Mhm.
peering deep into the human soul, and not always having to talk about God and the restrictions and cliches of only being commissioned by the church, and it was a great move in society to humanism. I guess is what came out of
Yes,
that.
and I think that's and there was the humanist a movement in the Renaissance in Italy and in other parts of Europe and England. But again, it's always it would you have to keep in mind for us is that there was a distinction that was always there was a religious element to it, and it's really hard to say that the ultimate purpose of the Shakespeare canon has a religious bent to it, because it really doesn't.
No,
It's a,
no.
and if you especially if you look at everything else that was written at the time, everything was very devotional, or it had was there's a lot of other elements or political or something else. But so I think that's when we look back at these works, it's I think it's I really wanted to show that this is not about some dead old white guy writing some books that aren't relevant to our times. We're really looking at a body of work that basically created the modern world, and that both with Montaigne, the French philosopher, and with these
Yes, of
writers
course. Yeah.
was that they created really the modern sense of ourselves, and where we fit in the universe.
That's fabulous. Great, really, idea. But of course, it was kind of the start of the British Empire, and I was thinking how ambiguous that it was a great thing at the time, but when you look back on it, colonialism hasn't gone that well. So it was a start, but I
Right.
mean, humans just expand outwards, I think.
Well, that's one of the things I wanted to show. So, as for people who read the novel, it starts in Ireland, which is really kind of the beginning of the English colonialism. It was like where they go there, and
Yeah.
I
North was exiled in Ireland, and he fought battles there. He
yeah,
was a general also, wasn't he?
yeah, he was definitely he went to Ireland a number of times too later on in life as well. And but when he was a kid there, and when he after his mother dies in Ireland, and then he goes to live with his aunts and his aunt's husband and their son, it's a horrible contrast to his life growing up with his mother and his legal father. And
Yeah.
there's a scene where he's raped as a little boy, and of course
Yes.
the guy who does it is English, and so it was something that I wanted to show in a very violent and visceral way of
Yeah. So that's a
emotion.
kind of metaphor, political
Yes,
metaphor. Yeah.
yeah. Here was this English guy who was raping this little kid. It was well in the story he's half Irish and half French, and so
Yeah.
yeah, that element of colonialism is very much so, and I play around with it too in terms of the different secret societies that are at work in the
Yeah,
novel.
absolutely. I found that quite tantalizing, and I was always hoping I suspected, because if you started to bring in too much of the future, I think you'd have lost the thrust of just telling the guy's stories, because you kind of have it.
Yeah.
The first maybe third of the book is Thomas North, and then each chapter is kind of laid out as another piece in the puzzle. So you reckon that the first portfolio was the work of all those, how many? 13, 14 authors?
Well, yeah. So the first folio. So I wanted to time out the publication of this book on December 5th of 2023, which is 400 years after the first folio was published in 1623. So the novel explores 14 different authors, from Thomas North to Thomas Middleton. But I really believe that there was another 10 that were involved. So you're looking at like 24 different people that were involved from the beginning of like when the plays were first written in the 1550s, when Queen Mary was in power, to the publication of the first folio. So yeah, it was a culmination of a lot of different people.
Yeah, this would have been a crazy conspiracy theory when I was at school. But I think it's is it becoming common knowledge now, or are there what's the academic line? If you if you care.
Interesting, actually, academically. So what has happened in the 21st century? It started in the late 20th century, but definitely in the last 20 plus years, conventional, traditional Shakespeare academia has accepted the idea that these works were not the creation of one man. Like that, the top level, highest Shakespeare academics are all acknowledging that there were other people involved in writing these plays. That they still believe it was Shakespeare, and he was the main genius, but they believe that Thomas Middleton, co-wrote Measure for Measure, that he did revisions to Macbeth, that other people, Thomas Nash, who you and I have talked about already.
Yes.
That he wrote the first act to. He wrote the first act to Henry VI, Part 1. That other people were involved, Marlowe, of course. So it's definitely becoming like an accepted thing.
Bacon, Francis Bacon.
Francis Bacon was, so for people who don't know, the Shakespeare authorship question. So there's an interesting thing to this, right? So when it was officially started was in the 1800s, the mid 1800s, and there was a people who were putting forth the theory that it was Francis Bacon who wrote the plays and poetry, not Shakespeare. And so then ever since then, there's been one candidate after another, but it was Francis Bacon was the first alternative candidate. But actually, it goes back to the time of when these plays and poetry were being published. So in the 1590s, there was a published back and forth between two poets, John Marston and with Marston and Hall. I forget Hall's first name, but they were going back and forth, and they said that the Rape of Lucrece and Venus and Adonis, the two published poems with Shakespeare's name on them, came from the House of Bacon. So it had Bacon's motto on it. And so, of course, Baconians, people who think it was Francis Bacon, say that's a clue that it was actually Francis Bacon, or his brother Anthony Bacon too. But for my opinion, just in terms of Francis Bacon, I think he was a fascinating figure, enormously important for history, especially for the scientific method, with his theory of induction, setting forth evidence to prove your theory. Enormously influential. And a great writer too, but I don't think he wrote or had much to do with the writing of the plays and poetry. I just don't. I've read his works, and I just don't see the connection there. But I do think he was heavily involved in making sure that the plays were collected in the first folio of 1623. Him and John Florio and Ben Jonson were helpful in getting that going and putting it out there for sure.
Yeah, so with the character of Thomas North, we get a beautiful bit of him visiting France in his childhood and kind of developing, and then there's a big gap of time, and then we meet up with him again in London, and he's running around with the kind of it reminds me of the idea of a clerical underground, but they're a kind of literary underground, but they're politically involved, and they're also courtiers and all that kind of scene, rich people, titles. That must have been fun to research.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, it was. This was like probably most of my books I've written are very autobiographical, and I certainly it brings me pleasure to write about my life as well. But I think this was probably the book I enjoyed writing the most out of everything, just because I felt like this whole process, this whole time, I was there with these people. I was writing these stories and these scenes. I was really trying to try to come across as authentic as possible. And so that's why I wanted to write it in modern day English, so that it seems like it was real to me, and I would make it written in this kind of way where it did feel like it wouldn't be that far connected from their way of speaking back then. But yes, there definitely was like North in this novel is kind of like the ringleader of this literary underground. Absolutely. And the public don't really know much at all about this guy, this Thomas North character. There's a scene in the Ben
I'd
Jonson.
never heard of him.
Yeah, he's known as So for people who don't know watching this, so Thomas North is he was a translator. So he was a translator, most famously known for translating, Plutarch's Lives. So Plutarch was a Roman historian, and what he did was he compared the lives of famous Greeks and famous Romans, and see the similarities and differences between them. And what he focused on was character. So he focused on their individual characters and their types, right? And so from Julius Caesar to Mark Antony to Cleopatra to Pericles to all these different, to Coriolanus and so forth, Timon of Athens. And these all became plays in the Shakespeare canon. And so Thomas North, he translated not from the original Latin by Plutarch, but from the French by this guy named Amyot's, and which is one of Montaigne's favorite books, was Amyot's French translation of Plutarch's Lives. But he also translated some other books early on in his career. He translated a book called Dial of Princes, and later The Moral Philosophy of Doni, and then at the end of his life, Nepo's Lives. But that's who he was. But yeah, he certainly was not famous at the time. There's a scene in the Ben Jonson chapter when Essex is executed, the Earl of Essex, and
that's. I didn't know the history really, so when Essex got executed, I was like, "Oh my God, they got him!" Because I kind of.
But there's a young actor who comes to tell Ben Jonson after Ben Jonson was just spent the morning screwing his mistress. Ben Jonson was known for having affairs with married women. He boasted of it.
He was a swordsman.
He killed somebody in a duel. He avoided capital punishment because he converted to Catholicism and could quote some Catholic thing. But Nathan Field comes in and he's like, he says, "Hey Ben, Essex has been executed, and he's telling him the news." And Ben Jonson is like, "Hey, we got to go get to North." Because what happened was, and Nathan Field was like, "Who the hell is North?" Right? He has no idea. He's an actor, right? So that was true. Like North was not known. He was very underground. But North was it was interesting that North was paid the highest. He was given the biggest reward for stopping Essex rebellion, and out of everyone, given the most money for it. So obviously, he probably gave some information to the Queen and her men. To basically let them know about the uprising, and then after the execution, he was stationed at a certain part of London to oversee to make sure that there wouldn't be a further rebellion.
Yeah, that's right. It was like an embankment or a, yeah, it was all very
Yeah,
interesting. You wrote very well, and kind of looking at it from a writerly point of view, it must have been so difficult to move from one event to. I find that difficult in writing, to move from one event to the other, kind of seamlessly. You need to drop a lot of information. This happened, this event. So you do that very well, and naturally the time passes very well
thank you.
in your novel.
Thank
Because it is, I would say, firstly a novel, and secondly a historical attempt at the authorship question. It seems
Yes,
quite personal to you, and you've written every single character in there.
absolutely. Yeah, it's definitely, you're right. It's definitely a novel first, and I don't try to put it forth as this is definitely a work of fiction, and so it's not a
Science fiction almost, I thought earlier when I
yeah.
was reading it. Some of it is, because there's also your it could be your flow of consciousness writing that you use in some of your great other novels that we've done. We did a show on Black, didn't we? That was
Yes,
the
we
one
did. Yes, yeah.
So check that out if you're watching now. But so this has, but it's very stripped back. It's only the odd paragraph of this, but it uses modern terms, band names, I think, modern cultural references anyway. So you're kind of stepping out of time, and there is a sense of that throughout the whole book. That you know that one day the Shakespeare myth will be launched on the world and become so influential, and invented archetypes, really, didn't they?
Absolutely. Yeah, I threw in there those what you're talking about, those passages there, that the disjointed,
Yes.
what I call chaos riddle prose. It's like a surrealistic stream of consciousness, and it's definitely, yeah, I a lot of times, and you're talking about like the modern band, so a lot of times the way I write is those passages is I'm listening to music, and so as I'm listening to music, I'm
Okay.
hearing phrases from a song that I'm hearing,
Yeah.
and then I put those
Yeah.
phrases into those things, and so
Yeah.
I put them at certain points, sometimes at dramatic moments in the story, and I really feel very strongly about the importance and how you can create a disjointed, disconnected uh, feeling in those moments that, in a way, almost highlights those moments more so.
Yeah. Oh,
For
yeah. Yeah.
like when Will Hunter's mother dies in the beginning, the first chapter, it cuts. He says, my mother, after describing how his mother died, and the blood, and his younger brother that was going to be born dies in her stomach, and very kind of tried to be vivid, but in this violence and this very extremely sad and painful moment, and then it cuts to one of those disjointed surrealist poetical passages, and it's that kind of, it creates a highlight to that moment that just happened, but also it
Yeah.
creates that the unexpected, the uncertainty, which is what happens in the story. A lot of uncertain things happen from one
Yeah.
moment to the
Absolutely.
next, and that's the way life is.
Yeah. I'm wondering if it's harder writing a historical novel in some ways, because you have to fit your characters into certain dates that are in all the history books, or it's harder to do fiction where you have to make it all up. Because it seems like that's probably what. Did you say you've been working on this for 30 years? 30
Yeah.
years.
So I've been writing it. I've been coming up with different, like, plot outlines and stuff over the years, and so it's something that it's been really, like, in terms of the research part. I've never spent this much time researching for a story, but that was like when I really I was really disappointed with Shakespeare's biography as a teen. I think I was like 14 or 15, and I was just so disappointed. Like, you know what? Someday I want to write the story, what really happened, and how it made, at least it make sense to me. It made sense to me. So I've been just really, I was just been hungry to find out the truth of what happened. So I read book after book, and I was really into Edward de Vere for a long time. Then it was Christopher
Yeah,
Marlowe,
that
Bacon, then Henry Neville, and then just William Stanley, the Sixth Earl of Derby, and it's just a lot of different candidates have come and gone. I've made my own up, and so it was just a lot of research. So I think one of the things that helped me in writing the story is that when I actually got to writing the story itself, was that I had already, a lot of the times were very vivid to me in my mind, because I already had been spending just so much time reading about those times that it became easier to me. Like if a character makes a reference about a situation or another person, I didn't have to go and look it up in a book, because it's like, oh yeah, I remember this thing about Richard Barnfield, or this thing about Michael Drayton, or about Robert Greene, or John Webster, and so forth. And the things came a lot easier to me because of so much time was spent on researching those times for these last three decades.
absolutely. So I guess as the idea develops, you're already talking about writing a book on Nashi.
Actually,
Is that,
yes.
yeah.
Yes. I am very much, as the title suggests, in the things I explore in the book is agnosticism. So the characters, North, and of course his lifelong friend Montaigne, are dedicated agnostics in terms of embracing doubt, uncertainty, and a lot of the people in this, as you say, literary underground that North inspires, a lot of them embrace uncertainty and ambiguity as well. And so I've another thing that I've been wanting to do for a very long time was to tell a story from at least two different perspectives. Sort of like there was the Japanese filmmaker Akira Kurosawa did this brilliant film called Rashomon, and Rashomon is basically tells this one event of where there was a man and his wife who were robbed in the forest in Japan, in medieval Japan, and there was a witness. So the film, it tells that event from the four different perspectives. So from the perspective of the wife, from the perspective of the husband, from the perspective of the bandit who robbed them, and from the perspective of the witness. And it's brilliant. It's a fascinating story. And by the end of the movie, you're kind of like wondering, well, which
Which
perspective is the
one
real
was true? Yeah, exactly.
true, right? And so
Yeah.
I remember seeing that again as a teen. It was way back then, and I was like, oh, I would love to do something like that, either in a story where we have like something happened, but then you have different perspectives on what actually happened. So
Well,
this has always been something I've been into, and so this
that's
last
what love chaos is all about, really, isn't it? That the embracing of agnosticism and uncertainty. Really, that's what you're
right.
about, man.
So I came. So the thing is, as much as so, here's the thing for people who are interested in the English Renaissance, right? So it is filled, is so rich. There's just, you could probably spend your whole life reading the different texts from those times, and you're still going to miss something. So in my 30 years of researching, I knew, of course, Thomas Nash was very, very well known. He's a well-known figure at the time. He was a satirist. He wrote great satires. He poked fun at people. And I liked his writing, but then I came across a interview of some guy who put this preposterous idea that Nash didn't exist, and he was just a heteronym. So a heteronym is where it's not only like a pseudonym is just a name, but a heteronym is where you actually create a whole person. And so this guy argued that Thomas Nash wasn't a historical figure; he was actually a creation of Edward de Vere, the Earl of Oxford. So, but what he did though was he opened up a whole window to there's these enormous parallels of Thomas Nash's writing with the Shakespeare canon, and I started to investigate, and I started And then I found another academic who was showing the parallels, and another one, and another one. So like in January, I was like doing a lot this last month, just finding all these parallels. And then I started to read Thomas Nash's writing, his kind of like a short novel or a long short story called The Unfortunate Traveler, which follows this page during Henry VIII's time, Jack Wilton, who is, by the way, is referenced in Alan Moore's League of Extraordinary Gentlemen. It is amazingly written. It was just so rich. Thomas Nash had such an amazing command of the English language, and is actually right now in 2023 is kind of seen like a little bit of a Nash renaissance. So last year there was a podcast release, a series in England that was done about Thomas Nash. There's the Thomas Nash Project right now. There was a book that was released about a biography on Thomas Nash by Andrew Hadfield, who was an excellent biographer, who did an excellent biography on Edmund Spencer. And so I'm just starting to eat up all these things about Thomas Nash. And so it gave me the idea, and it reminded me of that old inspiration I had as a teen, and it's popped up every now and again. So I thought, well, why not tell the same story but in a completely different way? Yeah. So right now I'm currently working on telling the story. It's going to have the same cover. It's going to be called Anonymous, Agnostic, Antichrists. So instead of it being the work of
Plural.
A bunch of different authors, it'll singular, right? So mostly on Thomas Nash. And so he, of course, he collaborated with a lot of others. The others mentioned in the book. But he was the main genius, and so the story will follow his biography and how he came to write the Shakespeare plays and poetry.
I mentioned it to you earlier, but it's kind of funny because you're pretty much, out of all the guys that meet in the pubs and get drunk and who are with male and female drunken sots they all were, you're kind of the most unsympathetic to him. Yes. He's a bit dour, and all the others are like beat poets, but he's the old, and now you like him.
Yes, it was fascinating. It was just I find him far more fascinating and likable and lovable than I originally did last year, and I find that there's a whole opportunity to explore his journey, and so that's the thing about the beauty of history, is that the more you look into it, the more layers are unpeeled, the more things you find that you realize that what really happened. And so my intention is not to say that what you find in Anonymous, Agnostic, Antichrists, the one that's out now, is not true. I want to present two possibilities, so that by the end of this year, this new version of the story that will focus on Nash will be released on December 5th of this year. It will be present another possibility. And so the whole thing about agnosticism for me is being okay with different possibilities, that there might be a spiritual reality to existence, and being okay with that. There might not be a spiritual reality to existence, and I'm okay with that. So I think that it's something that's been very dear to me, that we don't have to be attached to one instead of something else.
We don't have to always be right.
Exactly.
And we can have contradictory points of view, and they can still be kind of valid, because everything's possible, really.
Absolutely. And I think that that's true of so many different aspects of our lives, from politics to religion to everything. But it's also especially true with the Shakespeare authorship question. You find that there are people on all sides of the debate where they're so diehard dedicated to one person against another, and and sometimes the people, whether it be the Stratfordians or the Oxfordians or whoever, the Baconians or Marlovians, they get so antagonistic and take it to really personal levels, and make personal attacks against people who disagree with them. And I thought, okay, this would be great. Be like, here's this one guy who is okay with these two different possibilities. And because at the end of the day, if you look into the Shakespeare authorship question, you'll find validity to pretty much all of the arguments. There's some good points made by everyone, and there's some bad points made by everyone. It's not. I don't know if it'll ever be proven that who really did it. I mean, it's just. I think
Yeah.
it's so hard to tell.
Yeah, absolutely. Uncertainty is absolutely fine, and it's the only sensible way to live, really. But I can't. Obviously, we're not here to tell people how to live. So, what's are you still involved with like occultism and the magic side of things, Derek?
Yes, very much so. I have a definitely.
You touch on it here, but you don't go deep.
Yes, it definitely is explored in the novel. So it definitely there are actually some rituals that are in there. There's that
Scrying
one
for
there's a lot of
one.
scrying, yes. There's that one ritual that the African Moor does at the crossroads with Will Hunter.
That's right.
Right?
Yeah. That's right.
And so he does at the crossroads. He does a ritual there, and that's taken from an actual. I changed it a little bit, but I took it from actual rituals of Elizabethan England time. And there's also another ritual that Marlowe does with North as well. That was another ritual I took from the times as well. And but yeah, so it definitely explores the occult in the book. I think it's important to know that whoever wrote these plays and poetry, they definitely were very much involved in the occult. Probably perhaps the most autobiographical character in the whole canon is, well, besides Hamlet, I think, is Prospero.
Prospero, yeah.
And Prospero was, of course, he was a wizard, and he's depicted. He's a character. He's kind of funny, but he's also depicted sympathetically too, which is different from.
Yes, absolutely. It was. I mean, and King James was very against witches and all that. He wrote demonology.
Yes, King James was very much paranoid about witchcraft, and he from even before he became the King of England, when he was over there in Scotland, he was very paranoid in a number of instances where he felt threatened by witchcraft. There was one, I think, when his wife was coming overseas, from Denmark.
A shipwreck or something, and it was blamed on Scottish witches, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, and he believed that it was it was due to witchcraft. So he was very much paranoid about it. There's one of the characters in the book, Edward Dyer, who throughout Elizabeth's reign, except for a couple of year period where he was definitely fell out of her favor, but throughout her reign was pretty much in Elizabeth's favor. He also, by the way, he worked with Dee's Scryer. I'm just having a brain fart right now. Who was Dee Scryer?
Edward Kelly.
Kelly, yes. So Edward Dyer worked. He did alchemical rituals with Kelly, and scrying work with Kelly as well in the 1590s. But when King James came to power, Edward Dyer lost a lot of favor with King James, and I think one of the reasons was that James didn't trust him, and so it. But yeah, so there was definitely a lot of things, and then one of the other things I go into is the battle of the sexes, which especially.
Oh gosh, yeah, absolutely.
Amelia Lanier, who I do feel she contributed to the canon, and she was the lover of both Thomas Middleton and John Webster, and that's what I really love those characters in particular. I love Webster was a fascinating person, and then Amelia Lanier was fascinating, and Middleton was fascinating, and I love that part of where there's like this menage a trois kind of like between the three of them. But there was also a very heated conflict between women and men at that time under King James.
Yeah.
And,
so that dude that got his finger cut off, was that true, or was that put in for poetic license?
Oh, that's definitely poetic license. Yeah, I wanted to have.
It's hard to tell when you don't know the history. It really is, because right at the start as well, and I presume this is true, but you could be pulling our legs when you said you were talking to someone anonymously online.
Oh, yeah.
And
yes,
is that true, or is that part of the meta novel?
Well, that's what I kind of like. So the whole thing about this is that it is of course a work of fiction, but it is there was so much deception back in those days. There was so much there's so much play with illusion. What appearances, what could be actually be true, what's not true, and of course the whole book is about, well, what's the truth? Like, how were these plays and poetry, how were they written, and who wrote them? So I wanted to start off the book with that playful kind of that editorial, that this whole novel was based on an ancient, or not ancient, an old, 400 years old manuscript, right? And so yeah, I know, as much as I wish I would love that for it to be true, it's not. It's a make believe. I created that. I'm actually, so what, and I sent you the first draft of the next version of the book, which will have another editorial at the beginning, where it said that somebody reached out to me in January and said, and they were making fun of me, and they were telling me that I was a complete idiot, that I believed in the other person who reached out to me and told me that they had this true manuscript, right? And so that they were saying, like, well, no, that's not true. This is the true manuscript. This is Thomas Nash was the true author.
Yeah.
Like what you got, they didn't want you to know the truth. So here is the truth, you know. So it's definitely, it's a playful way to engage the reader. And again, as much as I wish it were true in either case, whether it was the manuscript written by Thomas North and the others, or in this upcoming version of the novel I'm going to do this year, that there was a manuscript written by Thomas Nash. As much as I would love it to be true, no, it was a fabrication on my part. I wish I was a good liar,
I had a feeling
because like I wish I had the talent of, say, like Crowley, and he was a genius at making stuff up and going all the way through with it. But I don't, and so I am not going to.
You're confessing straight away.
Yeah, I'm just saying. Yeah, it was a complete fabrication on my part. Yeah.
Excellent. Well, that's what writers are supposed to do, Derek.
That's right.
Make things up.
That's why most of my books are stories. It's literature. I do like writing nonfiction, but I love my true love as a writer is to tell stories.
Yeah. And every character is kind of you, really, I think, because you look at, after I start reading a novel, I start to think in the narrator's voice, and it's good if you can be. It's a true escapism.
Sure, no, it was definitely, there was some intention there, where there was some variation in terms of each author's voice, but I also wanted it to be kind of consistent. So it almost seemed like it could be the same person, right?
Yeah. And that's another thing with the Shakespeare plays. I mean, you could never tell that it had been so many different voices. They must have been kind of like the Bible, which is equally as dreamt up, I believe. And even the invention, even this idea of, what did you call it? You had a word for it earlier, when you make up a whole person. I suspect, and I think the futurer would agree, that Jesus Christ was a made-up kind of person. He's very politically. The Jesus question we must raise.
Yeah. Well, that's true. I mean, if we look at it, history is so important, and I think the more people research it, they don't have to necessarily come to finalized conclusions, but they should explore and be open-minded, because. And we should look for the evidence. You know, it's sort of like that's why, again, like going back to Francis Bacon, one of the things I loved about Bacon, even though I don't think he had much anything to do with the writing of the Shakespeare canon, one of the things I do love about him was his really strong belief of what he called induction, of setting forth through evidence, and just, you know, starting off with uncertain. Well, he believed in starting off in uncertainty to arrive at certainty. And my feelings, we don't necessarily have to arrive at certainty, but we can come close to it. And in the case of Jesus Christ, and not just Jesus Christ, but also Buddha too, and also
question everything really.
There's a lot of good arguments to be made that Jesus and Buddha and Abraham in the Old Testament that were not actual real people, and so they were just either creations to put forth a certain mythology or political or religious agenda, and so
Yeah.
it doesn't necessarily mean it takes away from what any of
No,
those
it doesn't
people
take away.
did.
It doesn't take away from the power of the work, really. Who created it? To me, but I guess for a lot more literal-minded folks, perhaps it does.
Yes.
But
Yes.
yeah, I noticed you put a little dedication at the front. Robert Anton Wilson was one of the most modern ones.
Yes.
And I think he had that same idea with the Schrodinger's cat trilogy, and multiple viewpoints and uncertainty,
Definitely.
quantum
definitely-
uncertainty, even.
Yes, Robert Anton Wilson is probably one of my favorite writers of certainly of the last 50, 60 years or so. I think that he's one of the last great writers. And as you pointed out, that there's not a lot of modern writers in my dedications. It's true. I don't. I think
That's true.
there's not. I do need to check out that one Scottish writer that you mentioned to me, Alistair Gray.
Oh, Alistair Gray, yeah, he wrote the
Yeah.
Poor Things film.
Yeah, I love that
people are
film.
talking
And
about, yeah.
you mentioned some of the
Lanark is a classic novel. Anybody that watches this should read Lanark for a bit of Scottish magical realism, I guess you'd call it. But great man, Alistair Gray. Indeed.
Yeah, I definitely want to check his works out for sure. But yeah, most of my influences and inspirations were in the past for sure. Yeah.
Okay. That's great, Derek. Thank you very much for coming and talking to me. Good luck with your next book, and I'm sure you'll come on for your next project. Thank you very much. Cheers, Derek.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you so much for having me on here.
It's always a
Great.
pleasure, man.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Cheers, Derek. I'll talk to you soon.
Yep.
See you later, brother. Bye-bye.
Bye.